Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Brandsbyre. In the 176th year of the Common Reckoning, an army of raiding orcs marched up the river Whitewater and into the foothills of the northern mountains, leaving a trail of devastation behind them. In the hills was a tarn, sheltered under a barren hillside. By this tarn, Brand built the Hall of Brandsbyre, where he dwelt with his wife Asfrid and their household. They survived by fishing the lake for trout and grazing their sheep on the surrounding hills. Brand had a reputation for being honest and wise, and his neighbours looked to him for leadership. As the orcs looted and burned the surrounding farms, the local dwarves assembled at Brandsbyre. Brave though they were, Brand knew that this small band of farmers and miners would stand little chance in battle against the Orcan horde. What he needed was spear dwarves, and the only spear dwarves in the vicinity were at Utdal, in the service of Halnor, the son of Halgi. Brand therefore sent the female dwarves and the children to Utdal to seek shelter and to ask Halnor to send assistance. Asfrid did not accompany them. She took up sword and shield, insisting that her place was to fight at Brand's side, and could not be convinced otherwise. Brand and Asfrid and their miscellaneously armed followers stood nervously outside Brandsbyre, waiting. All told, they numbered about 50. To their right was the tarn, and above it the hillside. Before them stretched a valley, at the far end of which huddled a couple of copses of windswept trees. From that direction echoed the harsh call of a discordant trumpet, and then through the trees 250 armoured orcs came streaming toward them. Brand's heart fell. But then Brand's heart rose, for the braying of the Orcan trumpet was answered by the clear tones of a dwarven horn, and beyond the tarn 200 dwarves came marching over the hill. For Halnor had heeded Brand's call and come to his aid with all haste, with 150 mailed spear dwarves and 50 crossbow dwarves in his train. Over the hill marched Halnor and his retinue, and the orcs saw them and uttered a great roar, redoubling their pace, eager for the fray. Halnor ordered his crossbow dwarves to line the top of the hill, where they could shoot over the tarn at the advancing orcs, while he led his spear dwarves down the hillside with the aim of joining up with the dwarves defending Brandsbyre. Meanwhile, Brand and Asfrid arranged those defenders into a line, a single rank of ill-equipped, apprehensive dwarves, facing an onrushing mob of ferocious and well-armed Orcan warriors. A group of orcs detached themselves from the rear of the Orcan charge and began to ascend the flank of the hill, advancing toward the crossbow dwarves, who had now begun to loose quarrels into the main mass of orcs below them. Halnor scrambled down to the shore of the tarn as quickly as he could. About half of his spear dwarves managed to keep pace with him. However, the remainder did not, struggling to descend the steep hillside and lagging behind. Another volley of crossbow quarrels hissed into the crowd of orcs charging towards Brandsbyre. 1 or 2 orcs fell, but the bulk of them continued to rush forward, undeterred. And now the party of orcs that had ascended the hill had reached the crest, and were moving along the ridgeline, closing swiftly on the nearest group of crossbow dwarves, whose initial reaction was to cease their shooting into the valley and back away from this looming Orcan menace. The orcs responded by jeering at the crossbow dwarves, accusing them of cowardice, chasing after them, taunting and challenging them to stand and fight. This had the desired response in that the dwarves ceased their retreat. However, rather than simply waiting passively for the orcs to fall upon them with sword, axe and bill, the dwarves launched a volley of crossbow bolts into the oncoming orcs, which, at least for the moment, stopped the orcs in their tracks. Down in the valley, Halnor and his advance party of spear dwarves had now rounded the tarn. They hastily formed a shield wall and moved into a position to threaten the left flank of the remorselessly onrushing Orcan horde. But the spear dwarves could only watch as the Orcan vanguard crashed into the thin line of dwarves defending Brandsbyre. Brand and Asfrid shouted encouragement to their contingent, who doughtily stood their ground and drove the orcs back. But the orcs kept coming. A second wave massed in front of Halnor's spear dwarves. The dwarves lowered their spear points and slowly marched forward. Orcan trumpets sounded, and the orcs roared, a roar of hatred and bloodlust. And then the orcs threw themselves at the dwarvish shield wall. Many a hero would have turned and fled in terror in the face of such a charge. But the dwarvish shield wall stood firm. Again the orcs threw themselves at the shield wall, but only succeeded in impaling themselves on dwarvish spears. The grass ran with red rivers of Orcan blood. The group of orcs atop the hill regathered themselves and charged through a hissing horizontal hail of crossbow bolts into the line of crossbow dwarves facing them. The crossbow dwarves were unarmoured and suffered terrible casualties, but here too the dwarves stood their ground. And now the orcs in the valley formed up again. Every last orc that could still stand gathered to the banners. And then the orcs made one last charge, their most powerful charge yet, covering the entire length of the dwarvish line. And again the dwarves stood firm. And then Brand called the dwarves around him to one last effort, and he and Asfrid and their followers countercharged, and the orcs before them broke and turned and fled. And then the panic spread, and all the living orcs in the valley were fleeing back the way that they had come, leaving many Orcan corpses behind them. The orcs on the top of the hill observed this reversal. Many of them also turned and ran. But the bravest of them, contemptuous of such cowardly behaviour, redoubled their assault upon the crossbow dwarves. Ultimately, these orcs were slain, but they died a death for an orc to be proud of, and took many dwarves to the grave with them. Thus were the Orcan raiders defeated. Thus did Halnor make his name. And thus ended the Battle of Brandsbyre.